Audio logs from the Interstellar Coalition's deep space archives usually sound like static screaming or silence. But File 77 Alpha is different. It starts with the deafening, bone-rattling roar of an apex predator, a sound known to liquefy the bowels of seasoned veterans. Then the camera feed stabilizes. We don't see a mangled corpse. Instead, we see Cadet Skylar Pendleton, a 22-year-old kid from Columbus, Ohio, holding a portable field camera. He wipes mud from the lens pans over to a terrifying 6-ton alien monstrosity with razor-sharp mandibles and says, "Smile for the camera, buddy." The folks back at the Academy are never going to believe this. This is the classified true story of the deadliest final exam in military history. The Interstellar Coalition Academy, situated in the freezing vacuum of the lunar mare Tranquillitatis, was designed to break the weak. Its curriculum was simple: prepare humanity to survive a galaxy that actively wanted them dead. Cadet Skylar Pendleton was not supposed to be there. He wasn't bred from a lineage of war heroes. He was an engineering dropout whose father worked as an actuary in Ohio, and his mother was a mid-level manager at a Boeing manufacturing plant. Skylar was scrawny, prone to motion sickness, and possessed a quiet, analytical demeanor that infuriated his drill instructors. "Chief Pendleton, you look like a stiff breeze on Earth would snap you in half, let alone the gravity shear of a Class 9 world." Commander Harrison's voice echoed off the titanium walls of the staging bay. Harrison was a veteran of the Sirius campaigns, a man missing half his original jaw, replaced with a gleaming steel prosthetic. Skylar adjusted the straps on his standard-issue Lockheed Martin Mark IV drop suit. "I'll manage, sir," he replied mildly, though his stomach was executing a flawless series of barrel rolls. Today was the final evaluation, the crucible. 40 cadets were being dropped onto Gliesa 832C, affectionately dubbed the meat grinder by the enlisted men. It was a tidally locked Deathworld. The designated drop zone was the Twilight Terminator line, a strip of perpetual dusk where the temperatures were survivable provided you didn't get eaten by the local flora or fauna. The objective: survive for 72 hours with nothing but a basic survival knife, a distress beacon, and a standard-issue ocular recording rig. Skylar strapped into Drop Pod 14, the heavy restraint harness locked over his chest with a metallic clank. Through the reinforced viewport, he could see the swirling, bruised purple atmosphere of Gliesa 832C rushing up to meet them. "Drop in 3, 2, 1. Good hunting, cadets. Don't die on my paperwork." Harrison's voice crackled over the comms. The explosive bolts fired. Skylar's stomach stayed in orbit as the pod plummeted. The atmospheric entry was a violently orchestrated car crash. Flames licked the ablative shielding, glowing a furious, blinding white. But then a sickening jolt rocked Pod 14. The telemetry screens flashed crimson. "Warning, micrometeoroid impact. Guidance system offline." Skylar's hands flew over the manual override console, his engineering background kicking in. But the Lockheed Martin thruster relays were totally fried. He was deviating from the Terminator line. He wasn't landing in the designated relatively safe Twilight Zone. The pod was screaming directly toward the planet's dark side, the Midnight Zone. A place of absolute darkness, cryogenic storms, and things that had evolved to hunt in the pitch black. The altimeter screamed. The retro rockets fired a fraction of a second too late. Pod 14 slammed into the canopy of a colossal crystalline forest. Massive glass-like branches shattered against the hull, slowing the descent just enough to prevent Skylar from becoming a thin red paste on the bulkhead. The pod tore through the undergrowth and hit the swampy ground with an earth-shattering crunch, flipping twice before burying its nose in the muck. Silence descended heavy and suffocating. Skylar hung upside down in his harness, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. The emergency lights flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the smoking cabin. He unbuckled, dropping to the ceiling of the overturned pod with a groan. He checked his wrist comp. No signal. The distress beacon was shattered. He was entirely off the grid, hundreds of miles from the operational theater. If he waited for a rescue team, he would rot here. He pushed open the jammed hatch, the hydraulic seals hissing in protest, and stepped out into the midnight zone. The air was dense, thick with the scent of ozone and rotting copper. Bioluminescent fungi clung to towering obsidian-black tree trunks, pulsing with faint ghostly blues and sickly greens. It was the only light source in a world devoid of a sun. Skylar dragged his survival pack from the wreckage. He had a combat knife, a thermal blanket, 3 hydration packs, a magnesium fire starter, and his shoulder-mounted ocular recording rig. The rig was meant to stream his progress back to the Academy grading servers, but with the comms array down, it was useless for transmission. Skylar looked at the blinking red light of the camera. A profound, crushing sense of isolation washed over him. He was 22, entirely alone, and statistically guaranteed to die in the next 12 hours. He reached up and manually engaged the camera's local hard drive. "My name is Cadet Skylar Pendleton," he said, his voice trembling slightly in the vast, echoing forest. He stared directly into the lens. "Current location, unknown. Designation Gliza, 832C Dark Side. Pod 14 suffered catastrophic guidance failure. I am stranded. If whoever finds this is human, well, please tell my parents in Columbus that I didn't die screaming. Or at least, I tried not to." He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. "I'm going to document everything. Maybe the biology department can use the footage of whatever eats me." Skylar's first priority was shelter. The crushed pod was a beacon for anything curious smelling of burnt ozone and human blood. He needed to move. He hiked for 2 hours through the treacherous terrain, the mud sucking at his boots like hungry mouths. Every shadow seemed to writhe. The soundscape was a nightmare. Clicks, deep bass rumbles that vibrated in his chest, and sudden high-pitched shrieks that cut off abruptly. He found a shallow cave formed by the tangled petrified roots of a massive fallen tree. It offered cover from 3 sides. Gathering bioluminescent moss and brittle dry sap, he used the magnesium starter to spark a small fire. The dancing flames offered a psychological comfort, pushing back the encroaching dark. He set the camera on a rock, framing himself and the fire. Entry 2. Establishing a perimeter. The atmosphere here is hyper-oxygenated. I have to be careful with the fire, but I need it to ward off the cold. Temperature is dropping rapidly. I estimate it's currently -20 degrees Celsius. Skylar then opened his pack, pulling out the ruined remnants of his pod's internal comms unit, which he had stripped before leaving. Using his survival knife, he carefully stripped the copper wiring and extracted the microcapacitors. For the next hour, his hands worked with practiced nerdy precision. He wasn't a soldier, he was a tinkerer. He rigged a tripwire around the entrance of the root cave, wiring it to the heavy-duty capacitors. "I've built a makeshift electrostatic perimeter alarm," he told the camera, wiping a smudge of dirt off his cheek. "If anything breaks the wire, the capacitors will discharge, creating a loud pop and a flash. It's not lethal, but it should startle any local predators. Human ingenuity, right?" He wrapped himself in his thermal blanket, clutching the survival knife to his chest. He didn't sleep. He lay there listening to the death world breathe. Around 400 hours, the sounds of the forest abruptly ceased. The normal ambient chirps and rumbles vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The hair on Skylar's arms stood up. Snap. A massive branch broke in the distance. Then a low, rhythmic thudding. Footsteps, heavy enough to shake the ground. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide. It was the apex. It knew nothing in this forest could challenge it. Skylar held his breath, his eyes wide in the dark, watching the entrance to his shelter. He slowly reached up and tapped the side of his camera, ensuring the low-light sensors were recording. If he was going out, he was getting it on tape. The tripwire snapped with a sharp twang. Instantly, the rigged capacitors detonated. Crack. A brilliant flash of blue-white electricity illuminated the darkness outside the root cave. An unearthly, deafening roar tore through the night, a sound of sheer shock and pain. The shockwave of the roar actually snuffed out Skylar's small fire, plunging him into absolute blackness. Skylar scrambled backward, pressing himself deep into the recesses of the petrified roots, gripping his knife so hard, his knuckles turned white. He waited for the massive claws to reach in and drag him out. He waited for the end, but the attack never came. Instead, the deafening roar shifted into a series of ragged, wet gasps. Heavy thuds shook the ground, followed by the sound of immense weight collapsing into the mud. Then, a low, resonant whimper. Skylar stayed frozen for what felt like hours, though the timer on his wrist comp told him only 20 minutes had passed. The heavy, ragged breathing outside continued. It didn't sound like a monster waiting in ambush. It sounded like something dying. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, began to override his terror. He was a dead man anyway, right? He reached to his shoulder, detached the ocular rig, and held it out like a shield. He switched the camera's floodlight to a dim red hue, less likely to provoke an aggressive response. Slowly, agonizingly, Skylar crawled out of his shelter. The red beam cut through the mist. 10 yards away lay the beast. It was breathtaking. It looked like a nightmarish fusion of a Terran dire wolf and a heavily armored theropod dinosaur. It was easily 15 feet long from its blunt crocodilian snout to the tip of its heavy spiked tail. Thick carbon-black scales covered its back, while its underbelly was a dark, leathery gray. But what caught Skylar's eye were the bioluminescent stripes running down its flanks. They were currently flashing a frantic, erratic crimson. The beast was lying on its side, panting heavily. As Skylar's red light swept over it, he realized why it hadn't attacked him. It was already in a fight for its life, and it was losing. Clinging to the beast's thick neck and underbelly were dozens of fist-sized lamprey-like parasites. They were a sickly translucent color, their bodies pulsing as they drained the massive predator's blood. The beast pawed weakly at its own neck with a massive scythe-like claw, but it was too exhausted, too drained to dislodge them. It looked at Skylar. Its eyes were pools of liquid gold, the pupils dilated with agony. In that moment, Skylar didn't see a terrifying apex predator. He saw an animal in pain. It was the same look his childhood golden retriever Buster had given him when it got its leg caught in a snare fence back in Ohio. "You're watching this academy," Skylar whispered to the camera in his hand. "This is the big bad monster of the Midnight Zone. It's being eaten alive by oversized ticks." The standard protocol dictated by Commander Harrison was clear. Never engage local fauna unless to kill or consume. Never show empathy. Empathy on a death world gets you killed. Skylar looked at the beast. He looked at his survival knife. He looked down at the emergency flare in his belt. "To hell with protocol," Skylar muttered. He set the camera down on a stump, angling it to capture the scene. He pulled the flare from his belt and ignited it. Searing, brilliant red magnesium light bathed the clearing. The sudden burst of intense heat and light caused the parasites to writhe. Skylar stepped forward. The beast rumbled a deep warning growl vibrating in its chest, baring teeth the size of combat knives. "Easy," Skylar said, keeping his voice steady, projecting a calm he absolutely did not feel. "Easy, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you. Let me help." He didn't know if the alien understood the tone, but the sheer exhaustion won over its aggression. Its head dropped back into the mud. Skylar approached the beast's neck. Up close, the smell was a mix of musk ozone and copper blood. He brought the burning flare close to one of the translucent parasites. The intense heat was too much for the creature. It shrieked a high, reedy sound and detached, dropping into the mud where it began to scurry away. Before it could, Skylar brought the heavy heel of his combat boot down, crushing it with a sickening pop. "One down," Skylar breathed. He spent the next hour working meticulously. He used the flare to burn the parasites, forcing them to detach from the beast's leathery hide, then dispatching them. For the ones dug too deep, he used his combat knife, slicing the leeches open and peeling their mandibles from the apex predator's scales. Through it all, the massive beast remained remarkably still. It flinched when the knife dug too close to its flesh, but it never snapped at him. It was as if it recognized the strange, hairless biped was performing a service. By the time Skylar crushed the final parasite, he was covered in alien blood and exhausted to his very bones. His flare sputtered and died, plunging them back into the dim bioluminescence of the forest. Skylar collapsed backward against a tree trunk, gasping for air, sliding down until he was sitting in the mud. He looked over at the beast. The erratic flashing of its bioluminescent stripes had slowed to a steady calm, pulsing blue. The beast raised its massive head. It looked at Skylar, its golden eyes unblinking. Slowly, it hauled its 6-ton bulk up onto its 4 muscular legs. It towered over the cadet. Skylar held his breath. "This is it," he thought. "I saved it, and now it's going to eat me for dessert." The beast leaned down, its massive snout inches from Skylar's face. The hot breath smelled like raw meat and electricity. It opened its jaws and gave Skylar's chest a firm, rough nudge with its blunt nose knocking the breath out of him. Then it curled its massive body around the tree trunk Skylar was leaning against, completely encircling the human in a protective wall of armored scales. It let out a deep, rumbling sigh that vibrated through Skylar's spine, rested its head on its paws, and closed its eyes. Skylar sat there, pinned between the tree and 6 tons of lethal alien muscle. He reached over, grabbed his camera from the stump, and turned the lens to himself. "Update log," Skylar whispered, a wild, disbelieving grin spreading across his exhausted face. "I think I just adopted a dog. I'm going to call him Barnaby." Skylar woke to a sound like a diesel engine idling directly against his spine. He opened his eyes, momentarily blinded by the absolute darkness before the bioluminescent glow of the forest slowly faded into his vision. The heavy rhythmic vibration against his back was Barnaby. The 6-ton alien apex predator was fast asleep, its massive ribcage expanding and contracting, emitting a low, resonant purr that felt more like a localized earthquake. Skylar checked his Garmin tactical wrist comp. It was 0800 hours standard Earth time. The external temperature sensor read -35 degrees Celsius. If Barnaby hadn't coiled around him, trapping their combined body heat in a makeshift biological sleeping bag, Skylar would have frozen to death hours ago. He unclipped the ocular camera rig from his shoulder, checking the battery levels. 70%. He engaged the recording light. Day 2. Hour 14. Skylar whispered to the lens, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. I survived the night, mostly because my new roommate is a living space heater. He panned the camera to capture Barnaby's massive armored snout, resting peacefully on paws the size of garbage can lids. The beast's bioluminescent stripes pulsed a tranquil, slow azure. I don't think the Academy Biology Department is going to believe this footage. The apex predator of Gliesa 832C, the monster they told us would rip a transport in half, is currently using my backpack as a pillow. Slowly, carefully, Skylar extricated himself from the beast's coil. Barnaby cracked one massive golden eye open, let out a huff of condensation that smelled like ozone, and lazily closed it again. Skylar took inventory. Water half a liter left in his Camelback tactical hydration bladder. Food 0 standard issue rations. Weapons 1 survival knife. Medical standard trauma kit. He was incredibly thirsty, and his stomach was loudly protesting the lack of calories. "All right, Barnaby," Skylar said, patting the beast's thick, leathery flank. The scales felt like cold Kevlar. "Time to get up. If I don't find water, I'm going to dehydrate before anything gets the chance to eat me." Barnaby stood up, shaking his massive frame like a wet dog, a motion that sent a shower of dried mud and crushed leaves flying into the underbrush. The beast sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. Then it looked at Skylar, gave a short, commanding bark, and began to trot into the dense obsidian-black forest. Skylar jogged to keep up. "Following the giant alien seems like a solid survival strategy," he muttered to the camera. For 3 hours, they trekked through the midnight zone. The terrain was brutal, jagged, crystalline rock formations and deep crevices filled with toxic-looking blue mist. Barnaby navigated it with an eerie, silent grace, completely contrasting his massive bulk. Twice the beast stopped abruptly, its stripes flashing a warning yellow. Both times Skylar froze. He watched as Barnaby stared down unseen horrors in the deep brush, things with too many eyes or too many limbs that scurried away from the Alpha's presence. Barnaby was Skylar's VIP escort through hell. Around noon, they heard it, the rush of moving water. Barnaby led him to a subterranean river bursting through the cavernous root system of a canyon. The water was pitch black, but fast-moving. Skylar quickly pulled out his LifeStraw military-grade filtration pump, praying it could handle extraterrestrial microbes, and began to drink greedily. As Skylar rehydrated, Barnaby waded into the freezing river. The beast stood perfectly still, a dark statue against the rushing current. Suddenly, his head snapped down with the speed of a striking viper. When he lifted his snout, an eel-like creature, easily 6 feet long and thrashing violently, was clamped in his jaws. With a sickening crunch, Barnaby snapped the creature in half, swallowing the larger piece whole. He then waded back to the bank, dropping the remaining bloody half of the alien eel at Skylar's feet. Barnaby sat back on his haunches expectantly. Skylar looked at the raw, twitching meat. He looked at the camera. He looked back at Barnaby. "Sushi," Skylar deadpanned. "My favorite." Using his magnesium starter and some dried river moss, Skylar managed to get a small fire going. He skewered the eel meat on a green branch and roasted it until it was charred black on the outside. It tasted like battery acid and burnt tires, but it was protein. "Entry 4, Skylar said, chewing mechanically. "Codependence established. He hunts, I cook. I think we're going to make... Skylar stopped. He held up a hand, silencing his own narration. Clank. Whir. It was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a beast or the shifting of rocks. It was the high-pitched whine of a servo motor. Mechanical. Artificial. Barnaby heard it too. The beast's stripes immediately flared an aggressive, violent crimson. A deep, guttural growl began to build in his chest. Skylar grabbed his camera and his knife. "That's not drop pod telemetry," he whispered. "That sounds like a drone." Skylar and Barnaby moved silently up the ridge, following the mechanical hum. Skylar stayed low, using Barnaby's massive form as moving cover. As they crested the hill, peering down into an expansive sunken clearing, Skylar's breath hitched. "Camera, are you getting this?" Skylar whispered, adjusting the focal lens to maximum optical zoom. In the clearing below, illuminated by heavy industrial floodlights, was a sprawling encampment. But it wasn't an Interstellar Coalition rescue team. There were two heavily modified matte black VTOL dropships that looked suspiciously like militarized Bell Textron Ospreys, their insignia stripped and painted over. Surrounding the ships were portable high-voltage containment fences. And inside those fences were massive reinforced steel cages built by Caterpillar heavy machinery, the yellow paint still visible under layers of mud. Walking around the perimeter were men and women in heavily armored, unmarked tactical gear. They were carrying what Skylar instantly recognized as Sig Sauer, XM7 battle rifles modified with underbarrel neurostunners. "Mercenaries," Skylar breathed. "Private contractors." But it was what was inside the cages that made Skylar's blood run cold and caused Barnaby to let out a muffled, agonizing whine. There were three other beasts of Barnaby's species. They were battered, bloody, and heavily chained with thick titanium tethers. One of them, a smaller female, was lying motionless, her bioluminescent stripes barely a faint dying gray. "They aren't just surviving here," Skylar recorded his voice, shaking with a sudden, unfamiliar fury. "They're poaching. Someone is paying private military contractors to illegally harvest the apex predators of Gliesa 832C. Skylar zoomed the camera in on a large crate being loaded into the nearest dropship. It was stenciled with the logo of Apex Biogenetics, a massive pharmaceutical and weapons manufacturer back on Earth. The Coalition used Gliesa 832C as a restricted military training ground. Corporate entities were strictly forbidden from operating here. This was a highly illegal black ops harvesting run, likely extracting the beast's unique bioluminescent glands, or their highly regenerative adrenal fluid for black market combat stims. If these mercenaries saw a cadet with a live feed to the academy, Skylar would be shot on sight. He was a loose end. The smartest thing to do, the only logical thing to do, was to retreat, find a cave, and wait out his remaining 48 hours until standard extraction. He looked at Barnaby. The beast was trembling, its golden eyes locked on the cages, its massive claws digging deep trenches into the rocky soil. It was looking at its kin. Skylar thought about his drill instructor. "Empathy gets you killed, Pendleton." "Hey, Barnaby," Skylar whispered, turning off the camera's active light to stay hidden in the brush. He reached out and placed a hand on the beast's snout. Barnaby looked down at him. "You saved my life last night. I guess I owe you one." Skylar wasn't a soldier. He couldn't shoot a rifle with any real accuracy, and he certainly couldn't take on 20 heavily armed mercenaries in a firefight. But he was an engineer, and engineers knew how to break things. He opened his tactical pack and dumped the contents into the dirt. He had a few feet of copper wire, his life straw, the trauma kit, the magnesium fire starter, and his camera rig. He also still had the heavy-duty microcapacitors he'd stripped from his drop pod the night before. He looked down at the encampment. The portable generators powering the high-voltage fences and the floodlights were positioned near the tree line, humming loudly. The mercenaries were relying on the sheer lethality of the midnight zone to keep them safe from the outside. Their guns were all pointed inward at the cages. "All right, buddy, here's the plan," Skylar said, working furiously with his knife, stripping the copper wire and connecting it to the microcapacitors. "I'm going to create a diversion, a big one. When the lights go out and the fence drops, you do what you do best." Barnaby let out a low, rumbling huff, as if understanding the assignment. Skylar strapped the camera back onto his shoulder. "Recording is active. Let's make a documentary." Skylar slipped away from Barnaby, using the dense obsidian underbrush to mask his approach. He crawled on his stomach for an agonizing 20 minutes, inching closer to the deafening hum of the Cummins portable diesel generator. Two mercenaries were standing about 40 feet away, smoking cigarettes and complaining about the cold in thick Texan drawls. "I'm telling you, Cole, this planet is cursed. Soon as we load the last gland, I'm taking my payout and buying a beach in the Caribbean," one of them muttered. "Just keep your eyes on the cages, Garrett. These things can snap a titanium chain if they get enough leverage," the other replied. Skylar reached the generator. He didn't have explosives. He couldn't blow it up. But he didn't need to. He just needed to short the main power relay. He took the bundle of stripped copper wire attached to his charged microcapacitors and carefully jammed it directly into the generator's exposed cooling fan housing, wedging it against the spinning turbine and the main electrical output line. He turned and sprinted back into the dark tree line as fast as his legs could carry him. 3 seconds later, the copper wire tangled in the turbine. It ripped the capacitors directly into the main power relay. Boom! A shower of blinding blue sparks erupted from the generator, followed by an ear-splitting mechanical screech. In an instant, the massive floodlights died. The hum of the high-voltage fences whined down to silence. The entire encampment was plunged into pitch blackness. "What the hell was that?" Garrett yelled. "Generators blue night vision now," Cole shouted back over the comms. But before the mercenaries could activate their tactical optics, a sound ripped through the clearing that froze the blood in their veins. It was a roar so loud, so primal, that it physically shook the trees. Out of the darkness, a 6-ton shadow, moving at 40 miles per hour, slammed into the side of the nearest Bell Textron dropship. The impact crumpled the armored fuselage like a tin can. Barnaby had entered the chat. The beast's bioluminescent stripes were blazing a terrifying, blinding red, ruining the mercenaries' night vision goggles instantly. Barnaby didn't stop. He pivoted his heavy spiked tail, acting like a wrecking ball, taking out 3 mercenaries and sending them flying into the mud. Contact. Heavy contact. Gunfire erupted. The staccato crack, crack, crack of the XM7 rifles echoed in the dark, the muzzle flashes illuminating Barnaby's armored scales as the bullets sparked and deflected off his thick hide. Skylar used the chaos. He darted out of the tree line, sprinting toward the steel cages. The mercenaries were completely focused on the rampaging Alpha, tearing their camp apart. Skylar reached the first cage. The electronic lock on the heavy steel door had died with the generator. He pulled the heavy latch, throwing his entire body weight into it. The steel door swung open. Inside, a massive, scarred male beast looked at Skylar. It saw a human the same species that had chained and tortured it. It barred its fangs, a low growl rumbling. Skylar didn't flinch. He pointed out toward the camp where Barnaby was currently ripping the mounted turret off a dropship with his teeth. "Go!" Skylar screamed over the gunfire. "Go help your friend." The scarred beast looked at Barnaby, then looked back at Skylar. It didn't hesitate. With a roar that vibrated the fillings in Skylar's teeth, the newly freed apex predator charged out of the cage and lunged into the fray. Skylar scrambled to the second cage, adrenaline flooding his system. He was a 22-year-old engineering dropout from Ohio, standing in the middle of a war zone on a pitch-black alien planet, orchestrating a prison break for 6-ton monsters. He glanced down at his shoulder rig, the red recording light blinking steadily through the smoke and mud. "Academy Command," Skylar yelled over the sound of tearing metal and screaming mercenaries. "If you're watching this, I think I'm going to need extra credit." The clearing was a symphony of absolute terrifying chaos. The freed scarred beast, essentially a 6-ton battering ram made of teeth muscle and rage, slammed into the mercenary line. It didn't just attack, it decimated. Sig Sauer armor-piercing rounds pinged uselessly off its carbon-black scales as it swept its heavy tail, sending 3 heavily armed contractors flying into the high-voltage perimeter fence. The dead fence couldn't electrocute them, but the impact against the steel posts shattered ribs. Skylar didn't stick around to watch the carnage. He scrambled through the freezing, churning mud toward the third cage. Inside lay the female. Her bioluminescent stripes were a sickly, flickering gray, and she was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Unlike the others, she wasn't just locked behind a door. She was secured to the floor with heavy titanium restraint collars clamped over her neck and hind legs. "Hey girl, hold on!" Skylar shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed the heavy steel door of her cage, throwing it open. He dropped to his knees in the muck, inspecting the collars. There was a magnetic locking mechanism secured by an encrypted digital keypad. His survival knife was useless here. He looked back at the battle. Barnaby was holding his own, pinning a mercenary under one massive paw, while tearing the mounted Gatling gun off a wrecked transport with his jaws. But the element of surprise was wearing off. "Fall back, form a firing line by the second bird," yelled a man in heavy tactical gear adorned with the chevrons of a private military captain. "Bring up the Lockheed launcher, burn that big bastard down." 2 mercenaries broke from the main group, running toward the surviving Bell Textron Osprey. One of them pulled a heavy shoulder-mounted weapon from an equipment crate, a Lockheed Martin FGM 220 thermal plasma launcher designed to melt through heavy tank armor. The merc hoisted it onto his shoulder, the targeting laser cutting a bright green line through the smoke painting, a dot directly on Barnaby's broad chest. Skylar's heart slammed against his ribs. "No," he breathed. Barnaby was fast, but he couldn't dodge a localized plasma payload. Skylar desperately scanned his immediate surroundings. Next to the cages sat a piece of heavy equipment used to offload the massive steel crates, a Caterpillar 9.5 OG C wheel loader, painted in its iconic, uncamouflaged industrial yellow, though heavily splattered with alien mud. Skylar bolted for the cab. He swung up the side ladder, ripping open the reinforced door. "Please be like the ones at the Boeing plant," Skylar prayed, remembering his high school summers working on the factory floor near his mother's office. Mercenaries were notoriously lazy when it came to equipment in secure zones. Skylar checked the ignition. The key was in it. He cranked it. The heavy diesel engine roared to life with a belch of thick black exhaust. Skylar didn't bother with the seatbelt. He threw the transmission into high gear, slammed his foot on the accelerator, and dumped the hydraulic levers forward. The massive loader lurched ahead, its heavy steel bucket dropping down to form a makeshift battering ram. The mercenary with the plasma launcher had a solid lock on Barnaby. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Hey, assholes!" Skylar screamed from the cab, though they couldn't possibly hear him over the din. The Caterpillar slammed directly into the side of the equipment crate the mercenaries were using for cover. The impact was deafening. The 6-foot steel crate crumpled and shunted violently sideways, knocking the heavy weapons specialist completely off his feet. The plasma launcher fired a fraction of a second later, sending a blinding sphere of superheated plasma streaking wildly into the sky, safely missing Barnaby and vaporizing the upper canopy of the obsidian forest. Skylar threw the loader into reverse, spinning the steering wheel hard. He raised the bucket and swung the massive machine around, placing the 10-ton bulk of the Caterpillar squarely between the surviving mercenaries and the cages. He was a human shield encased in industrial steel. The captain of the Mercs stared at the loader in absolute disbelief, his night vision ruined by the plasma flash. "What the hell is going on? Suppress that vehicle." Bullets began to rain against the Caterpillar, shattering the reinforced glass and peppering the chassis. Skylar ducked beneath the dashboard glass, raining down on his tactical rig. Seeing Skylar draw the heavy fire, Barnaby let out a roar of absolute fury. The beast's bioluminescence flared into a blinding, strobing crimson. He charged the remaining defensive line. The scarred beast flanked from the right. It was a perfectly executed pincer movement by two animals that possessed a terrifying, almost human, tactical intelligence. The mercenary line shattered. Panic set in. Aborting, abort. Get on the bird. The captain screamed, abandoning his men and sprinting for the open ramp of the surviving Osprey. The pilot was already spooling up the vertical thrusters. The downwash from the rotors kicked up a massive storm of mud and debris. 4 mercenaries, including the captain, managed to dive onto the ramp as the dropship violently lifted off the ground, leaving their dead and wounded behind in the muck. The Osprey banked hard, its engines screaming, and disappeared into the bruised purple sky of the midnight zone. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the crackle of localized fires, the hum of the idling Caterpillar, and the heavy, ragged breathing of the beasts. Skylar slowly peeked over the dashboard. The camp was utterly destroyed. He killed the engine, pushed the shattered door open, and climbed down. His legs felt like jelly, trembling so violently he almost collapsed into the mud. He unclipped his camera rig, the red light still blinking. "Entry 5, Skylar rasped, wiping blood from a superficial cut on his cheek. "Private military contractors repelled. Heavy machinery applied. I need a vacation." Barnaby trotted over to him. The beast was covered in minor lacerations, a steady stream of purple blood oozing from a graze on his shoulder, but he seemed unfazed. He bumped his massive snout against Skylar's chest, a check-in. "I'm okay, buddy. I'm okay," Skylar said, leaning against the beast's warm scales. Then he remembered the female. Skylar ran over to the dead mercenary captain's dropped gear. He searched the tactical vest and found a hardened magnetic skeleton key. He sprinted back to the 3rd cage. He slapped the key against the digital locks on the titanium collars. The heavy metal hissed and unclasped. The female beast didn't immediately move. She was starving, dehydrated, and severely wounded. Barnaby moved into the cage, letting out a soft, trilling sound. The scarred beast joined him. They stood over her, nuzzling her flank, communicating in a series of low vibrations. Skylar watched, adjusting the camera lens to capture the intimate, deeply empathetic moment between the so-called monsters. "They're a pack," Skylar whispered to the camera. "A family." He needed answers. Leaving the beasts to tend to their own, Skylar walked toward the only structure in the camp left relatively intact, a reinforced tactical command tent, heavily insulated against the cold. The inside of the tent smelled of stale coffee, synthetic tobacco, and ozone. A portable space heater hummed quietly in the corner. In the center of the room sat a folding tactical table, bolted to which was a Dell Rugged Extreme military-grade laptop, still booted up and running off an independent battery supply. Skylar set his camera down, framing both himself and the laptop screen. He cracked his knuckles. He might be a terrible soldier, but data systems were his native language. He pulled up a chair and began digging through the mercenary captain's unsecured files. It didn't take long. The folder was blatantly labeled Project Alpenglow, Harvest Manifest. Skylar's eyes scanned the documents, his stomach dropping into a cold, bottomless pit with every line he read. "Camera, you're getting this right," Skylar said, his voice deadly quiet. "These are shipping manifests. They're extracting the beast's spinal fluid and adrenal glands. Apex Biogenetics is synthesizing it into a combat stim called Aegis 7. It drastically increases human reaction times and regeneration. But the synthesis requires live harvesting. The beasts die in the process." He clicked onto the next folder, titled Acquisition Protocols. "To find the beasts, they need bait," Skylar read aloud, his eyes widening. "The predators of Gliese 832C are highly intelligent. They avoid mechanized patrols and avoid standard bait traps, but they are fiercely territorial. They respond to foreign biological intrusions." Skylar scrolled down to a subfile. A list of names appeared on the screen. Cadet Jenkins, R. Cadet O'Malley, T. Cadet, Pendleton, A. Skylar stopped breathing. It was the roster for his drop class. Next to each name were active GPS coordinates, broadcasting live telemetry. "They're tracking us," Skylar whispered, a profound sense of betrayal washing over him. The drop pod malfunction. It wasn't a micrometeoroid. It was a remote override. They intentionally drop a handful of cadets outside the safe zone every cycle. The panic, the blood, the distress beacons. We ring the dinner bell. We draw the alphas out of the deep brush so the mercenaries can ambush them. He clicked the final document. It was a digital payment ledger routed through a Shell Corporation bank on Mars. The authorizing signature on the coalition side, the man signing off on the acceptable training fatalities, and providing the dropship telemetry to Apex Biogenetics, stared back at him in stark black pixels. Commander Elias Harrison, head of Academy Training. Skylar slumped back in the chair. His drill instructor, the man who told them to never show empathy because it would get them killed. Harrison was selling his own students to a corporate meat grinder to line his pockets. The Crucible final exam was just a cover for an illegal lethal poaching operation. "They aren't coming to rescue me," Skylar realized, looking into the camera lens. "Standard extraction is in 48 hours, but if my pod deviated this far, they'll send a recovery team, a cleanup crew to make sure the bait didn't survive to tell the tale." Skylar pulled a proprietary SanDisk encrypted flash drive from his tactical vest, jammed it into the Dell, and began aggressively copying the entire hard drive. Everything: the manifests, the telemetry logs, Harrison's signatures, the bank routes. Once the transfer was complete, he secured the drive in a waterproof pouch inside his suit. He picked up the camera. "Command, if any honest officer is watching this live feed on a delay, hear me now," Skylar said, his tone devoid of the fear he'd felt yesterday. It was replaced by a cold, searing anger. Commander Harrison is compromised. He is trading cadet lives for corporate payouts. I have the data to prove it, but my orbital transmitter is destroyed. I can't broadcast this data back to Earth from down here in the mud. He pulled up a topographical map on the laptop. He cross-referenced it with his Garmin comp. About 60 miles north, piercing through the dense, stormy atmosphere of the Midnight Zone, was Mount Erebus. At its peak sat an old, abandoned orbital relay tower left behind by the initial survey teams a decade ago. If he could patch his transmitter into that dish, he could broadcast the data packet directly to the Coalition High Command servers on Earth, bypassing Harrison entirely. "I'm heading for the Erebus relay," Schuyler declared. "I'm going to blow this entire operation wide open." He walked out of the tent. The three beasts were waiting for him. The female was on her feet, now leaning heavily against the scarred male, but she was stable. Barnaby stood at the front, his massive tail swishing slowly. Schuyler looked at the 6-ton alien predator. They had both been used. They had both been marked for death by the same corrupt system. "Hey, Barnaby," Schuyler said, walking up to the beast. He patted the thick armored neck. "I have to take a walk, a long one, up that mountain. There's going to be a lot of guys with guns trying to stop me." Barnaby let out a low rumble. He looked at Schuyler, then turned his head to look at the other two beasts. He let out a sharp, commanding bark. The scarred male nodded his massive head, guiding the female gently into the dark brush, away from the carnage, disappearing into the safety of the deep forest. Barnaby turned back to Schuyler. He didn't leave. Instead, the beast lowered his massive shoulder to the mud, dipping his head, inviting the human to climb up. Schuyler stared in disbelief. "You want to give me a ride?" Barnaby huffed impatiently, sending a cloud of steam into the air. Schuyler smiled a grim, determined expression. He climbed up the thick scales straddling the beast's broad back, gripping the heavy ridge spikes like saddle horns. He clipped the camera rig securely to his shoulder. "Entry 6, Schuyler said over the hum of the wind. "New objective, the Erebus relay. Mode of transport, 6 tons of pissed-off apex predator. Harrison, if you're watching this, you messed with the wrong cadet." Barnaby roared a sound that echoed for miles across the dark canopy, challenging anything foolish enough to stand in their way. With a powerful lunge, the beast carried the human off into the obsidian forest, beginning the long march toward the summit. The trek up Mount Erebus was a brutal vertical nightmare. As they climbed higher, leaving the dense bioluminescent canopy of the Midnight Zone behind, the temperature plummeted. The air grew perilously thin, carrying a biting gale that felt like shattered glass against Schuyler's exposed face. If he hadn't been pressed directly against Barnaby's massively radiating 6-ton form, his blood would have frozen solid in his veins hours ago. Camera battery at 20%. Schuyler rasped his lips, cracked and bleeding. He kept the lens angled over Barnaby's spiked shoulder, capturing the dizzying drop into the black abyss below. Elevation is roughly 14,000 feet. The Erebus relay is just over the next ridge, but we've got company. Below them, cutting through the eternal darkness, were the sharp synchronized beams of searchlights. It wasn't just a dropship, it was a hunter-killer squad. Commander Harrison had realized his files were copied. He wasn't sending standard mercenaries anymore. He had deployed his own Black Ops retrieval team, Echo Actual, heavily armed and explicitly ordered to leave no survivors. Skylar could hear the high-pitched whine of Boston Dynamics' mechanized combat hounds leading the pack autonomous quadrupedal drones armed with twin-linked rotary cannons and thermal optics. "They're tracking my suit's residual thermal signature," Skylar muttered. He looked down at his Garmin comp. "We need to break their line of sight, or those drones are going to paint us for an orbital strike." Barnaby let out a low, rumbling growl, his golden eyes scanning the treacherous, icy cliff face. The beast possessed a hyperspatial awareness that bordered on precognition. He didn't just see the mountain, he felt its structural integrity. Barnaby moved toward a massive overhang of glacial ice that clung perilously to the side of the cliff, centuries of frozen ammonia and water perfectly balanced over the narrow pass the mercenaries had to use. Skylar instantly saw what the beast was planning. "You want to drop the roof on them," he whispered, a grim smile cracking his frozen face. "I can help with that." Skylar dismounted. He pulled out the final remnants of his drop pod gear. He had one emergency fragmentation grenade left in his tactical pouch standard issue, meant for clearing heavily fortified bunkers. He wedged it deep into a fault line in the crystalline ice directly above the pass. He then tied the pin to a length of his stripped copper wire, running the line back behind a heavy outcropping of basalt rock where Barnaby was waiting. "Come on, you bastards," Skylar breathed, holding the end of the wire. 5 minutes later, the mechanical clatter of the Boston Dynamics hounds echoed off the canyon walls. 3 of them trotted into the pass, their thermal sensors sweeping the area. Behind them marched a dozen elite operatives in heavily insulated whiteout combat armor, holding Heckler and Koch magnetic rail rifles. Leading them was Captain Griggs, a man whose reputation for brutality was well known at the academy. "Spread out, the thermal trail ends here. The kid is close," Griggs's voice barked over external comms. Skylar pulled the wire. The grenade detonated deep inside the glacial fault. The sound was muffled a deep thump rather than a sharp crack. For a second, nothing happened. Then the mountain groaned. A spiderweb of massive fissures shot through the ice overhang. With a sound like a thunderclap, 1,000 tons of ancient compressed ice sheared off the cliff face. "Avalanche, look out!" one of the operatives screamed, but it was too late. The sheer volume of ice and rock slammed into the pass. The combat hounds were instantly crushed, their metal chassis flattened into scrap. Half the mercenary squad was swept over the edge, their screams swallowed by the roaring whiteout. Griggs and a few others barely managed to dive into a shallow cave pinned down by the massive debris field. Skylar didn't wait to admire his handiwork. He vaulted back onto Barnaby's back. "Go, buddy, go!" Barnaby lunged upward, his heavy claws finding purchase on the sheer rock, carrying them over the final crest and onto the frozen wind-blasted summit of Mount Erebus. The summit of Mount Erebus was a desolate, howling graveyard of jagged ice and petrified basalt, completely devoid of the bioluminescent warmth that blanketed the world below. Here the atmosphere was brutally thin, and the wind shrieked with hurricane-force velocity, carrying shards of crystalline ice that scored the exterior of Skylar's Lockheed Martin suit like sandpaper. Rising from the frozen plateau was the Erebus Relay. It was a brutalist monolith of rusting titanium and heavy parabolic communication dishes, originally built by the first orbital survey teams and abandoned a decade ago. It looked like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the bruised, swirling skies of Gliese 832C. Skylar practically slid off Barnaby's heavily armored shoulder, his legs immediately giving out as his boots hit the ice. The adrenaline that had carried him up the mountain was rapidly burning off, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. He crawled the last 20 feet to the base of the relay tower. Barnaby followed slowly, the 6-ton apex predator limping slightly, his sides heaving like giant bellows. The beast's bioluminescent stripes were a dim, pulsing indigo, a sign of extreme thermal depletion and physical fatigue. "Almost there, buddy!" Skylar rasped his breath, freezing instantly on the inside of his cracked visor. Skylar dragged himself to the massive mechanized bulkhead door of the main control hub. Beside it was an external access terminal, its screen shattered and dead entombed in 2 inches of permafrost. Skylar didn't have time for finesse. He drew his survival knife and brought the heavy steel pommel down on the access panel, shattering the frozen casing. He ripped the damaged paneling away, exposing the ancient Cisco fiber optic trunk lines and heavy copper analog relays underneath. His hands, clad in insulated tactical gloves, were shaking so violently he could barely hold the knife. He clamped the blade in his teeth, using his fingers to aggressively strip the fluoropolymer insulation off the primary data lines. He unclipped the dead Dell Rugged Extreme laptop from his harness, ripping the motherboard free, just to salvage the primary input/output ports. He pulled the encrypted SanDisk flash drive from his vest, the drive containing Commander Harrison's entire illegal poaching ledger, the Apex Biogenetics manifests, and the telemetry logs proving the cadets were being used as live bait. Okay, think, Skylar muttered frantically, forcing his engineering background through the panic. The relay was powered down. He needed to trick the ancient analog system into accepting a localized power surge to wake up the transmitter. He grabbed the heavy-duty power cable connecting his drop suit to its primary lithium-ion battery. He sliced the cord, exposing the live wires, and jammed them directly into the Cisco power relay board. Sparks showered over his visor, blindingly bright in the eternal darkness, but a low subterranean hum began to vibrate through the deck plates. The geothermal taps were waking up. A small emerald green diagnostic screen flickered to life on the jury-rigged circuit board. Local uplink established, waiting for handshake protocol. Skylar jammed the SanDisk drive into the salvaged port and furiously twisted the spliced data wires together. Handshake accepted. Targeting High Command Mainframe Earth. Commencing data burst. A progress bar appeared on the tiny screen. 1%, 4%, 9%. "Come on," Skylar prayed. "Come on." Suddenly, the wind changed. The howling gale was violently overwhelmed by a deafening rhythmic thudding that rattled Skylar's teeth in his skull. Rising over the sheer cliff face of the summit was a nightmare of modern military engineering. It was a heavily modified Boeing Sikorsky gunship, stripped of its coalition insignias and painted matte black. Its twin coaxial rotors chopped the freezing air, kicking up a blinding maelstrom of snow and ice. Captain Griggs and his Black Ops retrieval squad hadn't just called for support. They had called in the heavy artillery. The gunship's nose pivoted with terrifying mechanical precision. Below the cockpit, a Raytheon multi-barrel rotary cannon spooled up with a high-pitched whine. A pair of ruby-red targeting lasers cut through the whiteout painting, the titanium bulkhead directly above Skylar's head. "Barnaby, get down!" Skylar screamed, throwing his body over the fragile jury-rigged terminal to protect it. The rotary cannon opened fire. It didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like the fabric of reality tearing in half. Armor-piercing, depleted uranium rounds slammed into the Erebus relay. Huge, jagged chunks of titanium, the size of engine blocks, were ripped from the structure. The deafening roar of the impacts was absolute, shaking the very foundation of the mountain. Skylar squeezed his eyes shut, debris raining down on his armored back, waiting for the round that would turn him into pink mist. But the gunfire suddenly ceased, replaced by a deep guttural roar that dwarfed the sound of the gunship's engines. Skylar dared to open one eye. Barnaby had not taken cover. The apex predator was standing tall in the center of the frozen plateau, entirely exposed. His bioluminescent stripes were no longer dim. They were blazing a blinding, furious, strobing crimson that lit up the summit like a flare. The beast's golden eyes were locked onto the hovering gunship. Barnaby dug his massive front claws into the ice. With a violent heave of his heavy neck, he ripped a jagged boulder of frozen basalt out of the ground, a chunk of rock easily weighing 2 tons. He spun with terrifying momentum, using his heavy spiked tail as a counterweight, and hurled the boulder directly at the Boeing Sikorsky. The pilot banked hard, but not fast enough. The basalt boulder clipped the gunship's left weapons pylon, completely shearing off a pod of unguided rockets. The aircraft lurched violently, alarms blaring from the cockpit. "Kill that monster!" The pilot's voice crackled furiously over the open, unencrypted proximity channel on Skylar's Garmin comp. The gunship stabilized and brought the rotary cannon to bear directly on Barnaby. Brrrr! The stream of depleted uranium rounds walked across the ice and slammed into the beast. Even Barnaby's carbon-black hyperdense scales couldn't fully stop heavy aircraft munitions. The rounds tore into his massive shoulder and flank. Purple blood erupted into the freezing air like steam. Barnaby let out a roar of absolute agony, his front left leg buckling. The 6-ton monster collapsed heavily onto the ice, sliding backward from the sheer kinetic force of the bullets. "No!" Skylar shrieked, his voice tearing his throat. He tried to stand to draw his pathetic survival knife, but the upload terminal beeped frantically. 82%, 85%. If he uncoupled his suit's battery now, the transmission would fail. Harrison would win. The poaching would continue. Barnaby would die for nothing. Skylar stayed pinned to the floor, tears freezing to his cheeks, his hand firmly holding the spliced wires together. The gunship hovered menacingly above the wounded beast. A heavy air-to-surface missile pod dropped from its belly. The targeting laser painted a solid red dot squarely on Barnaby's heaving chest. "Target locked! Wiping the board!" the pilot stated coldly. Barnaby, bleeding heavily and panting clouds of thick white steam, looked across the ice at Skylar. The beast's crimson stripes flickered, fading back to a deep, resonant blue. He let out a low, rumbling huff that sounded almost like a sigh. Then the apex predator of Gliese, 832C, did the impossible. Ignoring a shattered shoulder and a dozen gunshot wounds, Barnaby dug his hind legs into the permafrost. The muscles in his massive haunches coiled tight. With a final earth-shattering roar that echoed for miles across the midnight zone, Barnaby launched himself off the icy plateau. He leaped an impossible 30 feet into the air, launching his entire 6-ton bulk directly upward into the downwash of the rotors. The pilot barely had time to scream before Barnaby slammed onto the nose of the gunship. Massive scythe-like claws effortlessly punched through the reinforced ballistic glass of the cockpit. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the alien immediately dragged the nose of the Boeing Sikorsky downward, throwing the center of gravity wildly off balance. The air-to-surface missile fired, but the trajectory was ruined. It streaked wildly over the relay tower, exploding harmlessly into a distant peak, triggering a secondary avalanche miles away. The gunship, utterly out of control, with a furious apex predator tearing its cockpit apart, went into a fatal spin. The twin rotors caught the edge of the cliff face, shattering into 1 million pieces of carbon fiber. The aircraft plummeted out of